Good morning, all. Good morning to our online viewers, wherever you may be. My name is John Quijada. I spoke at last year's conference too. I'm happy to be back. And today I'm supposed to give a talk on language personality. What's interesting is when I got here this morning and I saw the program, I read what it is that I'm supposed to be talking about here, and it says something about an objective analysis of the subjective effect that different phonemic inventories, phonotactic patterns, stress patterns, and prosodic tone patterns have on giving a language its particular sound, and how that sound gives rise to an emotional impact on the listener, accompanied by an analysis of the extent to which various conlangs succeed, whether intentionally or inadvertently, at accomplishing the same thing. That sounds like a really fascinating talk. And, however, I wrote those words for Sai to use in this program probably about 8 or 9 months ago, and forgot all about them. And then this talk I'm going to be giving you this morning, I wrote about a month ago, not remembering any of what I just read to you. So there's a slight difference between what's advertised and what you're going to get. Because what's advertised sounds pretty pedantic and serious, and I think we're gonna have a little more fun than that. So to get things rolling here, we're gonna start by playing a little contest here, because we're talking about language personalities, which ultimately means phonaesthetics and phonotactics. What gives a language its sound? And ask yourself, how do you recognize what language you're hearing if you don't know that language? Obviously, you've got some foggy notion of the phonology and phonotactics and of the particular language. And this is where you get ideas about French being the language of love and German being a language that makes you want to conquer Poland. So just to get you thinking along these lines and for us to have some fun, we're going to start by playing Guess the Language. Now, this is a contest. I'm going to play you a snippet of an actual language being spoken. These are natural languages. We're not going to start with conlangs just yet. And you get to guess what the language is. You only get one guess, so you raise your hand. If you're wrong, you don't get to guess again. So be sure you know what it is before you raise your hand. And we have prizes, all right? So I have a prize here, a book called Latin for All Occasions. So you can say in Latin things like nonne minus obesus est, have you lost weight? Cave vomiturus sum, look out, I'm going to vomit. I got all kinds of things in here. You're fired, have you lost weight, etc. Fun little book. Anyway, we've also got another one, The Dictionary of Bullshit, a shamelessly opinionated guide to all that is absurd, misleading, and insincere. And lastly, Grammar Snobs Are Great Big Meanies, by June Casagrande, with such interesting contents, chapter titles as Semicolonoscopy, colons, semicolons, dashes, hyphens, and other probing annoyances. What else here? I'm writing this while naked, the oh-so-steamy predicate nominative. And how to drop out of high school in the 9th grade and still make big bucks telling people how to use good grammar. Anyway, interesting little books. So let's listen to our first one. Raise your hand when you think you know the language. If you don't get it right, I'm going to start giving you clues. All right? So let's listen to the first one. Hopefully this works out.
Une petite compresse, remets-le le cons ou soir.
Salut toi. Petra podazrevi?
Dagenta, grand poison et pu, bon oignon la tomate marpiche.
Matre, Petra au bout.
Grand poison guides, gant
Quelqu'un au podium. Schiste.
Non, non regista. Les rivoltano marriage.
Café au pot.
Okay, anyone want to take a guess?
Breton.
Hey, this is too easy, obviously. That's Breton. There's a reason it sounds French, right?
Yeah. I do have a question. Is one disqualified from guessing if one has ever studied the language?
For fun's sake, you might want to let someone else try and take a guess, but hey, if you know it, that's your advantage. Which prize would you like?
Can I get back to you on that?
Sure. Let's try number 2.
First pick.
By that I mean give me 20
Empty
seconds.
conquest. Admit.
Uusi ystävä, vanha tuttu. Tässä on sinulle mukava juttu. Kerromme kuinka Suomen kanssa elänyt on eri aikoinansa. Huomaat, että ystävän sauna lämmin on aina, ei vain lauantaina. Huvit kaupungit, järvet ja joet, talven viiman ja pakkasen koet. Kesällä sinua taas odottaa.
Okay, I
I
know
want the
why
Latin
you do
book,
it.
by the way. I want the Latin book, just so you know.
Okay.
Finnish.
It is Finnish, right. All right. You guys are good at this. Shall we do one more?
Empty conquest. Admit.
Istaikhaiko entä eikä kaljessa ainakin meltarkod jeevohti spelahossa nyt kui kedahat enigi arjesinhich elanitsi amanitso.
Okay, you've already won one, so you don't get to guess again.
Yeah.
Someone else want to try it?
Empty conquest.
Istaikhaiko entä eikä kaljessa ainakin meltarkod jeevohti spelahossa nyt kui kedahat enigi arjesinhich.
I'll give you a clue. This is definitely non-Indo-European. And actually, of the languages we listen to, this one, the speakers are physically the most geographically nearest to us.
Is it Arabic?
No, it's not Arabic.
Come on, people. It's not that hard.
It's the southernmost member of its language family or subfamily, I should say.
I guess Navajo.
Yes, we got it. Navajo. All right. So anyway,
I know it was Morpho just because it sounded like I mean, like it had
there's what it
this
looks
and
like
everything
if
else.
you're interested. So anyway,
I didn't see it. Okay, well, like, wait, I thought novel was out.
I take the title of my talk today from a long-forgotten little book. It came out in 1965 called Personalities of Language by someone named Gary Jennings, a non-academic paperback that was part of the craze during that time that Mario Pei started. Some of you may remember that name, as far as writing books that popularized language and linguistics to laypersons. And in this fun but academically useless book, the author writes such wondrous tidbits as, the liquid vowels of the Polynesian tongues conjure up visions of loveliness and languor, full moon and bright lagoon. Contrariwise, the gutturals of the German language sound to a non-German as harsh and forbidding as a winter in the Black Forest. The swoops and swirls of Persian script seem to a Westerner as voluptuous and sensual as the quatrains of Omar Khayyam. But Goethe writes tender and lyrical word music in German, and Persian is prosaically utilitarian for keeping the accounts of Iranian oil companies. The personality of a language, like that of a man, is the sum of many things not always apparent to the casual eye or ear. So that's what he's talking about for personalities of language. German, as it so happens, has a word for this idea of a language personality. They call it Sprachgefühl.
I learned that yesterday, actually, from a German friend.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah, he was struggling to come up with a word for it, and I said, you know, there isn't one in English.
Sprachgefühl. They always have good words like Zeitgeist and what's the one famous one? Yeah, Schadenfreude and all that. speech feeling, literally. So, two old philologists who were contemporaries of Tolkien, named Greenough and Kittredge, talk about Sprachgefühl in a book they wrote many years ago. They say, men of genius may take great liberties with their mother tongue without offense, but let them once run counter to its characteristic tendencies, let them violate its Sprachgefühl, and their mannerism becomes, as it were, a foreign language. And Jennings, back in this little book, writes, while the national language of a people has its own personality, a Sprachgefühl distinct from even closely related tongues, it is at the same time a complex of sublanguages, regional dialects, trade jargons, and the like, each of which has its own idiosyncrasies. Take a New York stockbroker and an Alabama sharecropper, or for that matter, any teenager and his grandfather. Each pair speaks one national language, but with worlds apart difference. Speaking of teenagers, this touches upon the issue of colloquial versus standard language. As an example, I want to show you something. Who can tell me what language is being spoken in the following conversation, the following dialogue?
It's English.
It's English, isn't it? G-Chet? Nah, it's Greek. What you have in mind? How about Thai? Okay. This starts to get outside the scope of the talk, but the phenomenon of colloquialism gets even more profound when we take into account the differences in lexicosemantics. So for example, here are two versions of the same English sentence. One in what I call SBA, standard boring adult, and the other in teen speak, for lack of a better term. In standard boring adult, it comes out as supposedly she's an heiress or something like that, versus the teen version, she's like supposed to be a fucking heiress or some shit. Now imagine how someone like our friend Janko Gorenc in Slovenia, struggling with his English, would try to interpret the teen version. He'd be scratching his head, something about an heiress either supposed to be engaged in sexual intercourse or supposed to be a pile of feces. I don't know. Anyway, back to Sprachgefühl. What we're ultimately talking about is Phonaesthetics and Phonotactics. Now, what is the definition of Phonaesthetics? I could spout some dry, pedantic definition of Phonaesthetics from a linguistics dictionary, but for our purposes today, I think it's better to look at defining Phonaesthetics the way that someone once defined art. You know, I can't say what art is, but I know it when I see it. So with that in mind, I would say that Phonaesthetics is the reason that Aragorn, having defeated the evil lord of Mordor, becomes king of the West and takes the name Elessar tel Contar, rather than having defeated the evil lord of Ailuan Yamare and being crowned under the name Kratchmert Brogsdoodle. Obviously, Tolkien understood the power of Phonaesthetics well. Ask yourself, would you feel the same way about Tolkien's elves if instead of speaking languages called Sindarin and Quenya, he had instead used two of his orc names for the languages to speak, so that they spoke languages called Lugdush and Uthak. Instead of Lady Galadriel singing I Lauria Lantar Lassi Surinen on the banks of the Nimrodel, she'd be Lady Gorbag singing on the banks of the Shagrat. Ek Gupcha Hoshrach Mul Ragurkuth Porchadruk. You know, would these books have sold as many copies? I don't know. It works in reverse too. Just how ghastly and foul would we find the orcs to be if they had names like Galadriel and Glorfindel? I mean, imagine a retelling of Pippin and Merry's nightmarish trek through Rohan being carried on the backs of the foul Uruks. Pippin grimaced at the foul breath of the lead orc, Altariel, as he leaned in close to shove a sickening gulp of Miruvore down the young hobbit's throat. Ha ha, can't take his medicine, cried Iluvatar, the grimy rival of Altariel, who wanted to take the hobbits to the Dark Tower in the evil land of Eresea. It just doesn't work, does it? Okay. Phonaesthetics is the reason that non-Germans love to pick on the poor German language. Look at the history of classical music. No one has done more for classical music than the Germans, with the Italians as definite runners-up. Yet, when we speak of classical music, it's Italian that is the language of the arts. We have no problem speaking of our love for Albinoni's Adagio, or that lovely Andante movement, but we never talk about Gustav Mahler's Langsam movement. We simply say, oh, the slow movement from a Mahler symphony. Yes, the German language gets a bad rap. Jennings again writes that its, quote, gear-grinding gutturals, unquote, remind one of a winter in the Black Forest. Yet, if we assume that by gutturals we mean uvular consonants, we find that when we actually analyze German phonology, the language has all of 2 uvular phonemes, and ch, right? Now, that's pretty paltry as far as uvular consonant inventories go. After all, the now extinct Caucasian language Ubich had no fewer than 20 uvular phonemes. I was considering trying to pronounce them all for you, but I'll spare you. I'll spare my throat. Okay. They get pretty wild. We've got your, first of all, your palatal series, your plain series, your labialized series, your pharyngalized series, and your pharyngalized and labialized series, all of which have their voiceless version, their plain version, their palatalized, what are we doing? I'm sorry, your ejective version, your fricative, and your voice fricative, you know. So anyway, if German's 2 uvulars make for a Black Forest winter, what do 20 uvulars make? The backside of Pluto, maybe? I don't know. Maybe that's why Ubich is extinct. Its speakers all froze to death speaking their language. Anyway, every language has its own Sprachgefühl, its own phonaesthetic and phonotactic signature. So is it possible to change the phonaesthetic personality of a language? Perhaps not, but it is certainly possible to hide it pretty well. We've already seen an example of this with our "Did you eat yet?" versus "Jichet," turning the pronunciation into a colloquialized version. There's other ways to change the phonaesthetic character by using an affected pronunciation or even mispronouncing. For example, 10 years ago, I visited the Czech Republic, and there was a tour guide who would accentuate English incorrectly by placing stress on inappropriate syllables. I can also screw around with tone and vowel lengthening and unnecessary gemination and the general rhythm. Or I can do a very poor imitation of an elderly upper-crust British gentleman, so that a sentence about lampshades can be made to sound as if the fate of the world was at stake. Now, some languages actually do this on purpose. How many, I know there's a few Japanese speakers here, and certainly several Japanese students. How many of you have seen enough Japanese movies to know that the Japanese seem to be very aware that as far as macho manliness goes, the garden variety Nihongo just doesn't cut it. So they deliberately affect what I like to call the macho growl in order to beef up the testosterone level of the language. Here's what I'm talking about, if it'll play correctly. Let's see. Next one. That sounds terrible. This PA system sucks. Anyway, you guys have heard that Japanese movie. Now, if the Japanese can do that, other languages that are seriously challenged in the phonaesthetic machismo factor should be able to do the same thing. For example, let's take a language like French, not generally known for being a really macho manly language. Just take a common, banal sentence like, who said that dogs can't learn to speak, right? We can really beef that up if we, instead of saying, qui a dit que le chien ne pouvait pas apprendre à parler, we can say, qui a dit que le chien ne pouvait pas apprendre? Of course, when it comes to phonaesthetics, the ultimate phonaesthetic language would be based entirely on onomatopoeia. Such a language, or in such a language, every word would sound like what it stands for. For example, this word. Right, which would obviously be the word for windstorm, right? Or this word. Which is obviously the word for ocean, sea, or something like that. Now, the problem with such a language is like the phonological equivalent to the Darmok language problem, is that what's onomatopoetic for captain, we have a calibration problem with the phase inducer. Now, before we get to thinking that each language is phonaesthetically unique and can't possibly sound like any other language, we need to realize that in fact, one language can hide inside another. This is the phenomenon of, for lack of a better term, pseudo-homophony. For example, here's a list of words and a couple of proper nouns. What language is this? English? No. Put them all together, and what do we got? Nous sommes pas français, mais nous pouvons dire des paroles comme bonne nuit. And it works the other way too. What language is this? These list of words and names. You got haute, set, comme, me, ex, pleur. This, as you probably guessed, is English. You ought to set out to become some famous Western explorer. And there's one for all of you to figure out. I want to create a conlang too. All right, let's get a little more serious. I have handouts here. Could I ask one or two people to distribute these handouts to everyone? All right, I'm handing you out a little handout. Handing out a handout. Entitled Phonaesthetic Considerations for Your Conlang. I think I've got slides on this too. The handout's a little more detailed than the slides. But, you know, what do you want to do? What kind of questions should you ask yourself when it comes time for you to choose a phonaesthetic feel for your own conlang? How do you go about manipulating these kind of things? There's no hard and fast rules. This is all very subjective. But these are some things that I've noticed about language that kind of give rise to general opinions about the phonaesthetic feel of a language. We start with fundamental questions about the phoneme inventories. You know, what should be your distribution of front vowels versus back vowels? Because generally, your front versus back vowel distinction is going to give a general sense of that light airiness to the language sound versus the dark, you know, more, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, more evil sound to your language. If you're going to use front vowels, to round or not to round. Once you put front rounded vowels in your language, well, let's put it this way. I don't think anyone's going to be taking your language seriously as the language of orcs, you know, or goblins, because, you know, they're going to be using such sounds. Should I have a schwa? You know, putting a schwa in a language, while excellent for a gnat-line feel, is certainly going to affect the phonaesthetics. You know, think of Romance languages that don't use a schwa versus those that do. It really affects the phonaesthetic feel of it. So ask yourself what you're going for. Onsets after consonants with the Y sound and the W sound, you know, the yod phenomenon, as they call it, will be something for you to think about in terms of the effect it has on your phonaesthetic sound or feel. Guttural sounds, obviously, to use a kind of non-linguistic term, you know, your uvular fricatives and stops. Africans, ch, ts, f. Very common sounds, but you notice things like the fact that Tolkien's not using them in Elvish languages. So why does he avoid them? They're just sounds like any other, because of the phonaesthetic feel they imply. Glottal stop. Glottal stop's very common around the world, but put it into a conlang and you aren't going to be able to help but affect that phonaesthetic feel of your language when all your syllables start sounding like this to the point you're overusing them. Is that stop and start feel that is instantly recognizable and people, laypersons would equate with Semitic or something. Or more persons a little more educated about language might think of as American Indian sounding or something like that. Secondary articulations: palatalization, labialization, gemination, rhoticization, pharyngalization, ejectives, aspirated consonants, nasal sounds, nasal release, nasal vowels. All of this is going to are both tools. This works in a two-way thing, in a two-way nature. There are tools you can apply to sounds to give more variety, but at the same time, there are also phenomena that once they're applied or once they're there, it affects the phonaesthetic feel and limits it or constrains it in a way that either that's what you wanted or that's exactly what you don't want. So you want to avoid these kinds of things. Exotic phonemes, these can be fun, especially if you can pronounce them, but you're definitely going to hear from people about what they think of your conlang. I myself, in my own conlanging, wouldn't know anything about this as far as whether it sounds like and all this stuff should be used in a conlang. Some people I've noticed really like the sound, the lateral fricative. There's something about that sound that people love. Anyway, phonotactic patterns and constraints. Okay, so we move up to phonotactics. What is phonotactics? To use an anecdotal definition again, phonotactics is why a word like sprulch could be a hypothetical English word, whereas a word like znatk could not be. It's the way that you can combine, or the constraints against combining your phonemes together into permissible sequences. And this is where you really start to affect the phonaesthetic feel. Notice that Quenya, for example, if you compare it side by side with the phoneme inventory of Polynesian languages or African Bantu languages, very similar phoneme inventory. So how come Quenya doesn't sound anything like a Polynesian language or a Bantu language or an Australian Aboriginal language? Because of the phonotactic differences, the different sequences that are permissible in terms of putting these, sequencing these sounds into a syllable. The big thing is the frequency of front vowels versus back vowels. And of course you get vowel harmony that really constrains on that. Rounded vowels, once again those onsets following consonants of the Y sound and the W sound, kie, twi, can give a very distinctive feel to your language. Tolkien uses that a lot in Quenya, for example, Quenya, for example, with a W after the K sound. The frequency of sibilants and other fricatives. Why? Because fricatives and sibilants are the sounds that laypersons listening to your language latch in on the most. It's like, oh, it had a lot of S's and shushes and h's and ch's and all that, So is that what you want them hearing? And then of course there's the overuse as too many ths and ths. Anyway, syllable structure. This is another big one. Open versus closed syllables. Do you want your kala maga munga dinga language or your krap chak language? It gives that staccato effect. And of course, most languages strike a balance between the two. And there are exceptions. Klingon, for example, almost exclusively closed syllables. give it that staccato rhythm that some people love and some people hate. Versus languages that are all open syllables, which, I don't know, I'm probably not alone in thinking that such phonotactic patterns are fairly boring. You know, they rob a language of an interesting phonaesthetic feel. So the balance somewhere in between. And of course, the number of consonant clusters and the complexity of your consonant clusters go a long way. You know, double clusters, obvious choices being with L or R, you know, pla, cla, cla, blah, bra. But how complicated shall we get? Shall we get 3-member clusters with S or 4, things like that? Which consonant clusters and the ratio of open syllables to closed syllables. Looking at vowels specifically, you've got the issue of diphthongs. Which ones? You know, rising, falling, diphthongs with the J, so I, A, Oi. Shall we get into some exotic diphthongs like Finnish with E and other semi-vowels? Dissyllabic vowel conjuncts, you know, like Semitic languages, Arabic, for example, doesn't permit dissyllabic vowel conjuncts. You've got to put a glottal stop between them, so you can't have a word like ruan. You'd have to say ru'an. You know, that affects your phonology, your phonaesthetics. So you're going to permit these dissyllabic vowel conjuncts. Vowel allophony, you know, we're starting to get into morpho-phonology a bit in terms of how you use allophones or under what circumstances they arise. We're going to be mentioning Sandhi and juncture rules in a second. But, you know, should you have a lot of allophones for your vowels, Ubik, for example, has 10 or 11 vowel phones that you can hear being spoken, but in fact only 2 vowel phonemes. In fact, I think I've got, let's see which one. This is Ubik, for all those who've never heard it. This is that language that was up there. Went extinct in 1992, and the last speaker, this is him speaking something in the language. Listen to all the vowel sounds that you hear. Anyway, so interesting, huh? That this language that supposedly has 80 consonant phonemes and only 2 vowel phonemes, and sounds like that. I heard you can hear all kinds of things in there. O and E and U, all because of the allophones that these consonants create for the vowel sounds. A lot of the reason you don't hear some of those like 20 uvular phonemes is because when you actually realize them in this language, their distinction is made on the vowel that follows, not within the consonant itself. Makes you wonder why they analyze the language as having so many consonant phonemes and not vowels. And there is a reason for that. It relates to the way that you parse the fact that it's an agglutinative language. And no, I won't get into the complexities of that. It's quite a start to get off track here. Anyway, tonic versus non-tonic allophony, and I give an example here of, say, Spanish versus Catalan, where Spanish vowels don't make any distinction between their stressed and unstressed versions of their phonology, whereas Catalan, you know, they all reduce down to only A or E or the schwa sound, and it gives a very distinct phonaesthetic feel. You listen to Catalan, you say, God, it sounds like Spanish, except I can't understand a word of it. It sounds like the person's drunk or something, because they're slurring. It's all slurry and blurred sounding, you know. Anyway, and for those Catalanophiles, don't take me wrong there, I'm a big lover of Catalan myself. It's my favorite Romance language. On with consonants. You want to think about the influence of semivowels. Consonant clusters should be heterogeneous or assimilate together. You know, so for example, do you want to keep them separate, like in Spanish, septiembre, that PT has remained from Latin, versus Italian settembre or Portuguese settembre, where they've, assimilation has taken over. The effect of liquids, you know, and this starts to get into diachronic effects through time, historical changes, kind of like what David Salo was talking about. So whereas a Latin root, clam, devolved into cliam and yam and sham and things like that. Metathesis and apocope, these are processes you can use for switching around consonants or deleting vowels. So a word like pericolo in Italian for danger, in Spanish to get some metathesis going on, peligro. In Portuguese, it's worn down all the way to perigo. Morpho-phonology, the rules by which you map your phonemes to actual morphological categories. Here you can really play with the phonaesthetic feel of your language. Should I use reduplication, for example, for pluralization or some other morphological category? Great, but it's going to affect your phonaesthetic feel. You know, when you start having words, and when like root kirup becomes kirup, you're going to start having repeated syllables, and it affects the phonological or the phonaesthetic feel. Umlaut, ablaut, diphthongization, dissyllabification. Should I get rid of vowels, syncope, apocope, aphoresis? These are all names for basically where in the word you take the vowel out. Or should you insert vowels, epenthesis, you know, where you insert vowels to break up consonant clusters or add things onto the end of a word. Mutation, you know, the Celtic style mutation, nasal mutation, turning things into fricatives, devoicing them, deleting them. Can make other kinds of mutation patterns where you add in L's and R's and things like that. Sandhi and juncture rules. If you're going to be doing a natlang, a natural style conlang, this becomes very important to make your language feel and look real. So when morphemes come together, the edges of those morphemes will probably change and collapse into each other, assimilate or dissimilate, depending. There's lots of ways to do it. You've got to think about the effect it's going to have. Tone and pitch. Do you even make a tone language? Which tones? Can you pronounce them? Will you have tone sandhi so that when two falling syllables come together, do they stay falling or does one of them change? These are all questions you have to ask yourself. Anyway, so shouldn't morphology and morpho-phonology and phonology be arbitrary? Logically, it is so, but on a purely functional basis, does it really matter whether a past tense is done by a suffix or ablaut or a change in tone? Roots themselves, are you going to make your roots big long syllables or single phonemes? I mean, let's take the root of the verb to eat across the world. Spanish, com, com as in comer, German, essen, the S. In the Ubich language, for example, the root for to eat is just the letter F. A single consonant root. There's a couple of those kinds of things in those Northwest Caucasian languages. Of course, you could have it be, Zorbuthrantienstio in your language if you want to, but, have you imagined a root so mysterious that it is completely silent, a zero-morph root? At last year's conference, David Peterson showed us zero-morph pluralization. We had some fun with that. But what about a zero-morph word root? Is such a thing possible? Actually, we have no further to have to look than Spanish, the verb to go, which morphologically speaking is a blank root mood plus ir, the infinitive marker, right? And you see this repeated if we go into the gerund form or the present participle yendo, which is basically blank plus yendo. And we see it again in the second plural imperative, familiar, eve, which is just blank plus the marker for that particular mood and person. So if the second person plural imperative is eve, what's the second person singular imperative of this word? Well, we can look at the word venir, to come, the counterpart of to go, and we find in Spanish that the imperative singular of that is ven plus 0. So what this means is that if I tell a child in Spanish to come, I say ven. And if I tell a child in Spanish to go, I say... I think the hand motion is important there. Actually, all of this is complete bullshit, as those of you who are Spanish speakers know. Anyway, let's put into practice some of what we talked about on the handout. I've come up with a subjectively vanilla-flavored sentence in a conlang, an insta-lang, so to speak, here. Little bit of, CV patterning, CVC patterning, nothing too fancy on the consonant clusters or whatever. And as you can tell, it doesn't have much of a personality. It's a little bit pretty, but it's not so pretty that elves would be speaking it. Apo ket olua taraskentel brihapra, if you want to pronounce it that way. Now, taking some of those rules we talked about on the handout, let's turn this into different derivatives phonaesthetically speaking. Now, what we're going to do has nothing to do with diachronic sound changes. I'm talking about just manipulating the phonaesthetic feel of this. So, I just turned, okay, there we go. So I'm going to turn this first into a Tolkien-esque, Elvish-esque type of language. We're going to go from Apoket olua tareskentel bihaprai to Ampie heth olwai taresentela periodie. Right? Now, does that have a different phonaesthetic feel to you than the original? What did we do to get there? Well, I've kind of mapped it out. So, apo, we add in a vowel apio, turn it into a semi-vowel apio, change the last vowel apie, put in an M in front of it to have a nasal there. Ampie, give it an accent to make it look cool. Ket, turn it into a fricative ket, turn the H into a K into an H, het, make it a long vowel, heth. Olua becomes olwa, and let's give it a little action at the end, olwai. Taraskentel becomes tarasentela by putting in some epenthesis there to break up some of the, well, not epenthesis there, we're going to simplify the SK cluster into double S, add in a vowel at the end. Brihaprai gets a lot more treatment to turn it into periodie, as you can see. But it's still just those simple rules of things like epenthesis, metathesis, devoicing, turning things into fricative, mutating things on a step-by-step level. Let's go for a totally different feel. Let's go for some like a complex thing like ha'oi yelta lu trasken shel bjofre, or bjofre. And you can do the same thing, taking the same original and applying different kinds of rules to get there. Here's the Klingon approach. If you want your ugly, staccato language, you can turn the same sentence into Poket urwa tashket nash gridzopra. Gotta have like bone ridges on your head to speak that one. But once again, all I did was take the original and start applying some processes, phonological processes to it to get there, step by step. And then here's one that I didn't provide the actual mapping of how I get from one to the other, but you could use those rules and processes to get to something that sounds like wepwa he yat obai a las gwenel it lispoahai. So, you know, a sort of pseudo-American Indian meets Northwest Caucasian sound, just to get exotic for exotic's sake. And if that's what you want your conlang to be, you can start with something very dissimilar and get there through these processes. Let's look at some conlangs and look at the phonaesthetics going on there. Now in these samples I'm going to give you conlangs. I've avoided conlangs that are meant to be members of existing Terran language families or subfamilies, so I didn't put any Rom-langs or anything like that. You know, because their phonology and phonotactics will already be partially prescribed by the parent languages or whatever. So let's go for some ones that are just came out of thin air. Here's a famous one from Mark Rosenfelder, who some of us know as Zompist, Verdurian. And the influences on this language, according to Mark, were from Indo-European sources. But notice how he's taken Indo-European style phonotactics and phonaesthetically created a language that is very natural looking, yet very original. You know, it looks like it could be Indo-European, but you can't identify it's any particular branch of Indo-European. And so it carries with it a realism that goes with the particular con-world creation that's associated with this language. I was looking for some sound files, but couldn't find any for that. Maybe Mark has them, but I wasn't aware of it. Piro esse fascotene uestu esosan uyelei. I'm trying to remember his stress rules, syllabic stress rules. Imdaluan verdure eluamun racontretu erlelno tal fascotene. You know, it comes off the tongue really nice and looks natural too. It's a great job. Here's one from a person whose purpose is to make a Elvish language spoken in Tolkien's creation on a different continent. Aman Iar. It's got an interesting con history to it. And here this person is, you know, basically using a lot of the same phonaesthetics, phonotactic rules as for Quenya and Sindarin. And it has a definite, you know, feel like that. Irielise elethan alanin erthendelon. Alan elethan anarin erhiron narnan. You know, makes you want to song your way through it. Here's a language I found on the internet called Minhast. And I wrote down at the bottom his influences. Phonology was Egyptian, Colloquial Arabic, Persian, Akkadian, and Korean. The grammar and syntax, his influences are Iroquoian, Ainu, Yupik, Georgian, Arabic, Persian, Basque, Tagalog, and Ilocano. Whew. And you look at it, and it looks like some, you know, ancient, you know, one of those languages that you see on the early expanded Proto-Indo-European charts, like Hattic or Hurrian, or one of those weird languages from back then that was either Proto-IE or related to Caucasian languages 4,000 years ago, something strange like that. So I really like this one. Here's one I found by a guy named Tom Corcoran. This is called Rrzla, and it's spoken, is the official language of the Milo, a felinoid race. So it's a bunch of cat creatures speaking this. And of course it's got lots of trills and purring sounds. You would like this one. So, Estiesgie
Different dialect from mine.
Here's one that appeared on the Zompist bulletin board earlier this year that a lot of people had fun with, called Hward Raz by Durandal Britting, who goes by the name, he's Swedish, he goes by the name Sipan, I think, on the Zompist bulletin board. And I'm not a fan of the orthography that he shows, which is why I showed you what some of the letters stand for up in the corner. But as an overall creation, this is just fun. And this is a language meant for cursing. It was created for the purpose of cursing. So you get things like what the sounds go. You smell dreadful, as if you spent the last weeks rolling around in rotting camel corpses and the excrement of elephants. And then you have drown yourself in a vat of mud, you worthless sack of fat. Your hair frightens little children. I've got other sentences here not written down. I can also tell you in private at lunch if you want to know the wired raz for the sight of you poisons my eyes like squirts of onion juice. And I would rather drink 7 kinds of disgusting bile than touch your snail-like skin. Okay. Here's one that's one of my favorite conlangs on the whole internet. Thung Gai by Henrik Teiling, who currently runs the Conlang Bulletin Board. It's a philosophical language, which is why it's near and dear to my heart, not others though. And this one, it's a fascinating language if you study it. Anyway, I got a sound file on this one.
Stał Christiu, gehaustum Christiu, hakhauklein, zatruste haukzoi hitluchkiu, sen staklei tahkiu, se gaatron tain dan tahkiu, zatruklei trukthau hauklei kai, hachtu klapristiu kleinklei ku, se hu hangata klei nieuwste, se gaatru suchen dan gaatru soestiu, kapersu van dan gaatru son nostiuste ho. Sandra Kuchuzuk Vanachitz an der Kloster, Sandra Trau, Sekörne, Traunda Zuklug, Thiuste, Taiha, Treikör, Kürkastiu, Begleiter, Rötju Ho, Rötrat auch Hegel Ho.
I mean, I'm just simply amazed that the guy can even do that.
That was actually Henrik.
I believe so. I don't think anyone else is going to do that. Yeah, so now you've all heard Henrik Teiling's voice, but only in Thin Guy. So, anyway, how much more time do we have?
5.
Can we extend it by 5? All right. The last part of my talk, I want to talk about phonaesthetics and music, because it gets fun here. We think of music and singing, and how singing certain languages will map to various types of music much better than others. So the suitability of phonotactical patterns to the type of music. I was talking to someone earlier saying, you know, Brazilian Portuguese is just basically made for samba music. Two interesting comparisons I want to make for you are between the languages Lingala and Wolof. These are two Niger Kordofanian languages from sub-Saharan Africa, but with a difference. Lingala is from the Bantu subfamily, Wolof is not. And as a result, Lingala is a language that is almost exclusively CV, consonant, vowel, open syllables. I think it only allows closed syllables with nasals. And as a result, the music that it is used for singing with, it's called sukus, is a very rippling, flowing dance music, whereas the music that is sung in Wolof is called Mbalach music, and is much more staccato and jumpy, stop and start. I thought I'd give you a comparison of the two, and the fact that the languages sung to them match their rhythms so well. This is see the... Anyway, on the conlang front, the only language I'm familiar with that's been really put to music in a extensive sense is the Quijada language created by Christian Vander back in the early 70s for his band Magma. Some of you may be familiar with this music or have heard of it. But once again, he decided, they're French, and he decided the French language was all wrong for the music that he wanted to make. So he created his own, and it looks kind of like this. So it's got this vague sort of Germanic, Teutonic, meets Hungarian kind of look to it. And, you know, I've always just admired the fact that he was doing something like this way back then. In fact, it was Magma's music that got me into conlanging rather than the usual Tolkien route. So I thought I'd play a little bit for you so you can hear what it sounds like being sung. Enough of that part. Interesting stuff, huh? Now, then again, there's some languages that are a very poor fit. Like, how many of you have heard French rap music? If you can't take it seriously. It just, I mean...
Actually, German works a lot better than French for that, which is bizarre.
It's just silly. Another language that, in my opinion, and Kelly Drinkwater Alioth shares my opinion on this, that is ill-suited for the music is Renaissance polyphonic liturgical music, which was sung in Latin. This music was designed to be extremely ethereal and beautiful, but these chorus voices, they're singing polyphonically, so different people are singing different melody lines, and they're supposed to all meet up at the same time when they pronounce all these Latin sibilants and consonant clusters, but instead, you just get a bunch of all through this music that really disturbs it. I want to play you one little piece, little snippet of this. The lyrics to what they're singing here are as follows. Loquebantur variis linguis apostoli, alleluia, magnalia Dei, alleluia. The first 3-4 words of this contain all kinds of sibilants and consonant clusters, whereas the last part do not. And listen to the difference between the first part of this as they're singing the variis linguis apostoli versus all the alleluia and magnalia Dei, where suddenly all the sibilants stop occurring. so Kelly and I were talking about this, and we came up with our own idea for the ultimate language for song. You know, what should be the phonology for the ultimate singing language? And we came up with a whole phonology, or a phoneme inventory and some syllable structures. And you can see that there's no voiceless sounds of any kind, and there's almost no fricatives except for v and lots of liquids, lots of semi-vowels. And I wrote some lyrics in this song just to show you what it would look like. You know, and this is just nonsense. And before you think that it is only used for something that sounds vaguely like an Australian Aboriginal language, I wrote some additional lyrics at the bottom that give it a totally, even though it's gibberish, it gives it a totally different feel phonaesthetically. Oh, why I really want to let you all know that every word of mine will be revealed to have another meaning. And why would anyone want to make their own conlang anyway? That's it. You guys want to play Guess the Language one last time?
Se dolem se dose mir me prek, moram verse isu i quhej malt. Vendesit, treguam da nešto me sjeljet pa za kont, me që kisha rënshi dhe bënde ftot, ndezën një zjarë dhe na afruan të gjithve. Pali mblodhe një tuf me shkarpa dhe me t'i vënë zjarë, doli një në përk nga të nxehtet dhe ju gjitë në dorë. Vendesit, kur e pane përkën që varen në dorën e tij, thoshin me njëri ti.
Did you have a guess? Anyone want to guess that one?
This is completely out of the blue. Romanian.
Close geographically, but no.
Czech?
Nope. It isn't European. It is its own branch of the Indo-European language. Doug?
Is it Albanian?
It is Albanian. Anyway, I don't know. I guess there's no time for questions, but.
Yes, actually, let's take a few questions. If you have questions, raise your hand. I'll have someone the mic.
Are we working now? Ooh, we're working. I'm David Peterson. Anyway, all right. So I was wondering, have you ever heard of the band Sigur Rós, the Icelandic band?
I've heard them mentioned on many occasions. Actually, I think Sai had recommended that I look them up one time. It's on my to-do list, but haven't gotten around to it.
Well, they're all right, but it's just interesting. So their second album was the one where I guess the lead singer decided that lyrics from real languages just weren't appropriate to their beautiful music. But the funny thing is that if you listen to these songs from the second album, they pretty much all have the same words that are in them. They always end up being something like il sai, and then if it has to keep going, il sai, and so it's like all these different songs with guys going il sai. Anyway, fun stuff.
I'll check it out. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. Yes.
It's interesting that you were talking about this, because I was thinking of your own language, if I'm pronouncing it right. You spent all these years working on it, and then at the request of your fans, changed the whole phonology. And my question is, did that hurt your feelings or violate your personal phonaesthetics?
That's a very good question. As a matter of fact, it didn't, for the following reason, that even though I myself am, oddly enough, a lover of this whole idea of phonaesthetic feel for language, because of the design principles involved in Ithkuil, I had to long ago give up any worries. Earlier versions of the language did still preserve my own personal desire for the phonaesthetic flavor of the language. But of course, by having phonological or phonaesthetic and phonotactic constraints, in a language like that, which is designed for morpho-phonological conciseness, I was giving up avenues that would otherwise be available to get that compactness. So long ago, a decade ago, I had to give up the idea of the language having its own specific phonaesthetic feel, which is why it ended up having one that was just solely the sum of its parts, you know, of all those phonemes, which, you know, is kind of, you know, a lot of people would think that it's ugly or at least unpronounceable. But, you know, the design principles were what were dictating that. So because there wasn't an existing phonaesthetic feel, not an unintended one anyway, for it to be violated or destroyed by changing it into Ilaksh, I didn't get offended, and I did it only at the request of a lot of Russian people who want to, crazily enough, learn this thing, but they can't pronounce all those adjectives and all that. So I basically simplified the whole thing for them to be able to try to learn it, and I wish them all luck, you know. Anyway, so thanks for the question.
Just wanted to make sure you were okay with that.
Yeah, actually I do have another language, conlang project going on the side that does reflect, you know, it's a return to Natlang style conlanging and with a full phonaesthetic flavor to it that I'll probably have up on the web in about 5 years or so. Anyone else? Thank you.
Actually, Malami on IRC has one question, which is, how does a person's native language affect how they view the personality of other languages?
I wouldn't know from any specific objective data. I would imagine, as I'm sure a lot of us would, that it has a profound effect on it. One example, actually, that comes to mind that her question makes me think of is there was a thread on Zompist recently, I think it was a recent thread, or maybe I just caught it late, where people were talking about what languages were their favorites in terms of sound. You know, they were talking about phonaesthetics. There was a phonaesthetics related thread recently on Zompist. And I found it interesting that the choices made by persons were very often you know, associated with what their native language was. For example, there was a user there, I think, he used to go by the name Izo Piru, I think it's just Izo now, I forget. But he's Catalan. And his favorite languages sound-wise are things like Occitan, Provençal, and Catalan, because he's Catalan, he loves the sound of his language. And so would he still like the sound of it if he in fact was, you know, Hungarian? I don't know. But yeah, I'd say there is definitely a strong association with that. For others of us, we hear something for the first time and we just fall in love with it. My guess is that maybe Jeff in the back there, the first time he heard an American Indian language like Mohawk or something, he just thought he had arrived in heaven or something like that. You know? So it's an aesthetic thing. It's subjective.
Does anyone else have a question? Okay. In that case, thank you very much, John.